This NDP debate series is brought to you by Business Leadership South Africa.
The National Development Plan is government's economic blueprint designed to eliminate poverty and reduce inequality by 2030. It emphasizes partnerships between business, government, labour and citizens. This series of debates in partnership with Business Leadership South Africa will attempt to understand the policy and get into the nuts and bolts of whether it's succeeding or failing. Most importantly, what needs to be done to realise this new South Africa over the next 16 years. Hello and welcome. I'm Bronwyn Nielsen, and joining me to discuss the NDP today is Khulekani Mathe, Acting Secretary of National Planning, Bobby Godsell, the Chairman of BLSA and an NDP Commissioner, Nku Nyembezi-Heita, Chairperson of the JSE, and in our London studio, Edward Parker, Managing Director, Head of Europe, Middle East and Africa at Fitch Ratings. Thank you all very much for joining me. Mr. Godsell, let's start with you, sir, as an NDP Commissioner and Chairperson of Business Leadership South Africa. What does the NDP mean to you?
Well, it's the first time our country has ever had a long-term plan. And since 1994, it's the first time we've had a plan that's gone beyond one electoral cycle, 5 years. So in life, it's better to have a plan than not to have a plan. The plan is not comprehensive and it's not perfect, but it's a pretty good way forward. The challenge now, however, is to implement it and to make it happen. And at the heart of the plan is the idea that this is a plan for society, not just for government. So we've got to mobilize business, we have to mobilize labor, we have to mobilize NGOs. Ultimately, we have to mobilize 52 million citizens to make it their plan and that they take charge. I mean, in the words of our vision statement, they sweep their own backyard. They do their part.
Before we go any further, we caught up with Finance Minister Nhlanhla Nene on the sidelines of the World Economic Forum in Davos in January, and we asked him about the implementation of the National Development Plan.
The medium-term strategic framework that we have now put before South Africa is based on the National Development Plan. All the ministries at work are now in the process of implementing their areas, key areas of the National Development Plan. And going forward, there is actually no other plan that the country has. We will only be evaluated on our ability to implement the National Development Plan.
Nku, when we talk about implementation, do you believe that the private sector is embracing the National Development Plan?
Well, I think it has embraced it loudly, for lack of a better term. And so what we saw last year, though, was us talking about embracing the plan. What is true is that there's many in the business community who are quite confused, I guess, about the exact role of the private sector, simply because when government did come out with action plans which are fairly immediate in nature, and they were coming out in the MBTS statement, as the minister just said, actually, the private sector didn't seem to have much of a role within that. So I think the issue now is to try and define boundaries so that each of the partners within this construct actually understand their role. In a way, there's a sense in my head that we cannot be expecting government to create jobs. I mean, no government anywhere really creates jobs. That's our job. However, what we should be measuring government on is on the underpinning system that would create a situation where we do, in fact, create those jobs. And on those issues also, it's not clear to me that the accountability and really the metrics are in existence for us to be able to say, well, it's 2-3 years down the road, how far are we in actually getting to that? So there's still quite a bit of work that still needs to be done.
Khulekani, let's get your voice in here and how perhaps we can eliminate the confusion that the private sector may be feeling around their role in the NDP.
Well, firstly, one is to place all of this in context. The context is that the plan was developed by a commission that is independent. So tasked with developing a plan for the nation, the plan sought to set a strategic direction for the country that would guide what government does as well as what business does. And so Minister Nene in the inset was talking about how government has developed a medium-term strategic framework, which is government's sort of way of saying this is what we plan to do over the next 5 years in implementing the plan. And we would expect that various other sectors of society would do the same, would say guided and influenced, perhaps even motivated by the NDP, this is what we're going to do. It should inform business strategy, it should inform what companies plan to do over the next 20 years. If the plan calls for higher levels of growth, that's what companies should be saying. How do we grow as a company? So I don't think that it's realistic to expect the plan to give out the detail of what each sector of society should do. It's meant to guide, it's meant to provide a strategic direction that then everybody should draw on to develop their own business strategies.
Bobby, you want to add?
You know, I want to say that we are very lucky. This is a kind of odd thing to say because, you know, men plan, I suppose God disposes. And so we have this great plan, but we then have 2008, which is the context of announcing and adopting the plan, the worst financial catastrophe, actually, to hit the global economy since 1929. And now domestically in South Africa, we have an absolutely enormous electricity crisis. So I think the context for business and government finding each other and becoming partners, and one should be very clear, the easy thing for a business community is to criticize the government. I mean, that business people, by and large, don't understand much about politics. And they don't understand the nuance of governing a country coming from a terrible past, heading for a better future. So I think there's been a kind of dialogue of the deaf between the business community and government. Now, we can't afford this rhetoric any longer. If we want the lights to stay on, and if we want to find our place in a new global economy, a brand new global economy, we better get our act together, and we better work together to build and rebuild and renew electricity supply and also global competitiveness for South African manufacturers.
Let's talk a little bit about the plan and what is being executed on the ground. So, and perhaps, Bobby, this comes back to you. What examples, tangible examples, are there out there? And this is before, Edward, I know you're waiting for us in London. I'm coming to you in 1 minute. What tangible examples to date have we seen?
Well, let me cite you one example, and which I find very encouraging. I mean, we've started a new dialogue with government. It's a private, constructive dialogue. So there's a presidential working group between business and government. One group is looking at regulation. For a long time, we've had a kind of left wing that's wanted a command economy and a right wing that's wanted complete laissez-faire and free market. We're talking about making existing regulation more effective, smart regulation, regulation that works. We're talking about a regulator's charter, that every regulation would have a line of appeal and a timeline that government would have to observe. That's concrete implementation of the idea of this plan.
Edward, let's bring you in from a rating agency's perspective and your thoughts on the current landscape in South Africa. You must have heard of the National Development Plan. What does it mean to you, sir?
I think the National Development Plan is a sound vision for the country. It recognises South Africa's fundamental problem. It just simply doesn't grow fast enough. It doesn't generate enough jobs or money in people's pay packets to give them a decent standard of living, enough profits for businesses to invest, or enough revenue for the government to build the infrastructure it needs and provide basic services. Also, from our perspective, we can see that it's adding to social tensions and makes it that much harder for the Treasury to keep control of the budget. I mean, just to give you a couple of figures, GDP growth in South Africa has averaged just 3.1% over the last 10 years. That's the lowest of any of the over 20 countries that we rate in Africa, and just over half the average for emerging markets as a whole. I think the NDP, not only does it recognise this problem, but it also is providing some of the solutions. If we look at studies going back years by people like the IMF, the World Bank, covering multiple countries, then there's a clear message. If governments do provide good infrastructure, good education, they introduce liberalising structural reforms, that does deliver stronger growth. And I think stronger growth is really what South Africa needs most of all at the moment to improve the economy and to provide decent social conditions for people as well.
If we talk about stronger growth, Nku, we know that 2014 was looking at around about 1.4% in terms of GDP growth in South Africa. If we're lucky, we're looking at around about 2.2% for 2015. So this is where all our energy needs to be focused. We've spoken ad nauseum about this 5% growth rate needed to create jobs in an economy where the unemployment rate is sitting at 25%.
Undoubtedly, and essentially I think that's the point perhaps Bobby was alluding to. Everybody feels the urgent need to do something about it now. So I think if there is something to take away from the past Davos and the discussions of last year, is that we're all tired of talking about whether, if, whatever. We just want to implement it and make sure that the implementation framework is robust enough to deliver the result at the end of the day. But if I go back to the point that Khulekani was making, it's not that business wants to be told what to do or where to slot in within the NDP. However, if we are to deliver on even a little bit of the ambition, there needs to be a level of joined up action. So if we believe that in fact the priority today sits in infrastructure, education and doing something about the labor regime, it doesn't help if in fact government goes off and start tinkering with water systems and, you know, I'm just making an example, but essentially there is a need at any one time for a meeting of the minds on what the priority is for that one period. So the electricity is an absolute agreed consensus view that that's a top priority on the infrastructure side. But from the mining sector, transport is also a big priority at the moment. So I think those are the kinds of conversations that will continue to be had in order to drive growth further.
Perhaps talk to the flexibility that is needed in the plan to adapt to the macroeconomic fundamentals.
Well, I like also to look at what works. That's always a good guide. And we've had an amazing story in South Africa over the last, 5 years. We've gone from having zero renewable energy production, solar and wind, to being now the 10th largest producer worldwide of solar and wind power. And what this required was for the government to allow realistic pricing and then to efficiently administer tenders. And we have $14 billion of investment that has gone in, and the power is there. So this is an example of when you get your act together, what works. We need this now in transport, we need this in renewing coal-fired stations, we need this in saving the electricity grid, we need this in making labour markets properly more flexible, not exploited, but flexible.
Edward, let's bring you in again. Electricity being one of the key areas of concern in the South African economy at the moment. How do you see that?
Yeah, I agree. It's a terrible situation where growth is just being thwarted by this lack of capacity to produce energy, and that's something that people have known about and been able to foresee for probably a decade, but yet not sufficient action has been taken, and that will constrain growth over the next few years, no matter what other policies are pursued. So it's a very worrying situation. I think maybe just to bring in a couple of other issues as well, we also have prevalent strikes which are costing jobs and growth and investment in the country and damaging the country's image internationally with investors. Another thing, we have this sort of mineral resources law in a kind of limbo for the past 12 months, again creating uncertainty that's putting off investment in one of the key sectors identified in the new growth path. We've had uncertainty about the nuclear program. There's now talk about land reforms and introducing restrictions on the nationality and size of ownership that people can have. So for a lot of the positive things that have been talked about in the NDP, there are also a lot of other areas where there seem to be a lot of uncertainty in government policies which I think are holding back growth.
Bobby, I'm coming back to you here. Isn't that key action for us in terms of sitting down as business, labour, government, civil society and ironing out those elements that are deterring foreign direct investors from putting their money into South Africa?
Well, yes, I don't want to ignore the foreign direct investors, but I want South Africans to get their own act together. I think if domestic investors are confident, foreign investors will follow. I think it's an internal focus. And we just got to take these issues one by one. I mean, on land reform, there are very detailed proposals in the National Development Plan, looking for partnerships between farmers and farm workers, looking to understand modern agriculture, where if you don't have actually access to retail sector and to supermarkets, you shouldn't be growing food. Now, we've got a pilot project in Mpumalanga. This is very exciting. We're seeing white farmers and government officials and black farm workers working together to design a money-making formula from producing food. I think this is absolutely exciting stuff. We just got to move from the plan to implementing the plan, and I think South Africans are capable of doing this. I mean, we surprised the world by not having a racial bloodbath 20 years ago. We now have to surprise the world by becoming a prosperous society.
Smoother labour relations. Couldn't we do some damage control on that front?
Well, I mean, I think the main thing there, and I'm not pretending to be an authority on the matter, but I think what has been said by other panelists is that we need to get better at talking to each other and understanding each other. So what we're seeing happening, whether it's in mining or other sectors, is clear demonstration of people whose fortunes and future are dependent on the same thing actually not working together. So we need to get better at working together. I mean, from a government business sector point of view, we're beginning to see elements of that. Bobby here talked about the presidential working group with business, where we're starting to focus on very tangible things and work on problems like that. We've got to get to the point where we do the same in all other aspects that seem to be holding us back as a country.
But the fact of the matter is that Labour is impeccably opposed. They're very loud about it. They make no bones about it. So if the plan is predicated on bringing Labour to the table, again, we need to have some clarity on how that's going to be achieved, and or what is the flexibility built within the NDP that allows us to make progress despite that really severe constraint.
Well, I mean, one would hope that sanity prevails. You could take away the NDP and say there is no NDP. Fact of the matter is that Labour and employers would have to find a way of talking to each other and solving problems. So if, in fact, anybody uses the NDP as a reason why there is lack of collaboration, that would be, in my view, short-sighted. The fact of the matter is that things aren't working as we have these prolonged strikes. We've got to reach a point where we say, how do we get out of this? And to me, it seems that that's where we need to get to.
I just want to get back to just one more on this, Bron. So if you have a plan, and we can all get very excited we have a plan, as we have been excited we have a plan, you then have to use that as a filter, presumably, not only of the things that you're going to do, but the things you will not do, simply because it potentially jeopardizes the objectives of the plan. So there's a whole variety of things that now need to align in a direction for people to have real belief and for the plan to have real credibility. To give you one example, investors at Davos, at every single session where the South African team spoke to foreign investors or potential investors, brought up the issue of immigration and the very, very recent rules and regulations that have been imposed. If we understand that we have a lack of skills in the country, particularly the advanced skills one requires in order to start stimulating jobs further downstream, you then have to question to what degree such a plan would have been filtered through the objectives and goals of the NDP.
Mr. Godsell, weigh in here.
Entirely valid challenge. Yeah, I think the new immigration rules are a big step backwards. I mean, for Chinese people wanting to get a visa, they can go to 2 places in all of China. They have to go in person to get a tourist visa. I mean, apparently our very large Chinese tourism has dwindled to almost nothing. And we will make mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes, but we should
Can we remedy them quickly?
Better at remedying them, and acknowledging them, saying we got it wrong, and fixing it.
Hopefully we won't see this in January 2016, Nku. The minister in government responsible for the NDP is Jeff Radebe. We also spoke to him in Davos, and he again emphasized the plan is a partnership.
We have consistently stated the fact that government on its own cannot be able to solve all the ills that afflict the South African economy. There's no silver bullet from government. That's why we require the private sector to come into the party. The president has been convening a series of presidential working groups with the private sector, with organized labor, in order to ensure that all hands are on deck, government, business, labor, and organs of civil society. This plan is not an ANC plan, is not a government plan, but is a plan that has been developed by all sectors of our society, government, business, and labor, and organs of civil society, so long as we meet our commitments as all stakeholders and also as ordinary South Africans, ordinary citizens, because citizens have a very important role to play in the implementation of the National Development Plan, including monitoring what we call active citizenry. So we need a fiscal discipline in order to ensure that we can be able to drive this program of ensuring that we can be able to develop our economy. So discipline within government, within the private sector, ordinary citizens, we can be able to ensure that those targets of creating 11 million jobs, of reaching about 5% growth by 2019 can be met.
Edward, let's come back to you. What are you looking for in terms of execution of the NDP? What are those milestones that you will give the thumbs up as they come to fruition?
Well, I think it's sobering to think that the NDP was actually approved in September 2012, so nearly 2.5 years ago. And it's really a case of evolution rather than revolution. There's lots of common elements that were there before, the new growth path, the industrial policy action plan, national infrastructure plan. So these things have been around for a while, and so far we haven't really seen great impact in terms of growth. I think stuff clearly is happening. We're seeing that we've got the medium-term strategic framework that's laid out these much more granular near-term targets, which I think is very useful. We've had the budget expenditure better aligned with the priorities in the NDP, and there's this whole infrastructure in the Ministry of the Presidency in terms of agreements and evaluation. So I think that's all positive. But if we look at some of the first-year targets in the medium-term strategic framework, a lot of them are about setting up reviews, writing reports, looking into things, doing some training. There's not that much which is sort of very specific, let's abolish these 10 anti-business regulations that hold back growth. So I think if we saw some sort of quick and easy wins, then that would really demonstrate that the government is taking action, it's cutting through some of the bureaucracy, and we're seeing results on the ground. So I think from an outsider's perspective, we would have more confidence that things are really moving forward and going to have an effect if the government could really point to these are the specific achievements that we've had. And I know it will take time, but I think so far we haven't seen a great deal.
And we're hoping to achieve some of that ground with the conversations that we're having at the moment.
Yeah. Let me say, I think that's an entirely fair challenge, but my appeal to Edward would be to make this concrete. So let's talk about electricity. That's really concrete. I think, if in a year's time the private sector hasn't been significantly let in to baseload electricity generation. The problem with renewables is that you have the sun when you have the sun, and you have the wind when you have the wind. But baseload is coal generated or other thermal generated electricity. You have it all the time. There is a concession now. The government's put out a tender for 1,500 megawatts of private sector generated electricity. Will it happen? If it does happen, it's a step towards opening up electricity generation to the society and to the private sector. It's a big shift in policy. the biggest shift in policy actually since 1923 in terms of electricity generation. So, we need to take each of these issues, land reform, labour relations, effective regulation, and set ourselves some milestones. We shouldn't be, with respect, waiting for the rating agencies to rate us. We need to rate ourselves, and we can do that.
Nku, you wanted to add?
I just want to add one point. So back on my favorite topic of the boundaries. So we now have a monitoring and evaluation part of the plan, which is a critical part of any big step change.
Because if you
program.
can't monitor, you can't manage.
Precisely. So if we are to take seriously that we are a partner as business in this whole story, then I think it is correct that business should form part of the monitoring and evaluation teams
Absolutely.
that come through, because actually we are in a position to take some of the changes that Edward talks about to larger audiences. There are things that are changing, but there just isn't sufficient communication of those, and Bobby gave you one in terms of the regulation. If you look at the mining sector, 3 years ago, everybody was screaming about MPRDA and Section 11 transfers. Something's being done about that. It's really becoming a lot shorter, but it's just not actually getting it out, because that monitoring and evaluation piece really has not been attended to in quite the same degree and format that it should be done.
Perhaps we need a better investor relations voice for the country. Khulekani?
So I mean, I think all panelists are actually right. Those in government have also been grappling with the same question. I mean, the monitoring and evaluation framework is pretty much geared towards monitoring what government does. We have no way of monitoring what other sectors of society, who, by the way, have a much larger part to play in the plan as to what's happening out there. So yes, I would agree that we need to talk a lot more to find ways in which the private sector has let in on those monitoring processes, and vice versa, because quite a bit is happening within government which doesn't get communicated. And in my interaction with many people in the private sector, I've also found that there's quite a lot that's happening that government is not aware of it. So yes, there's more that we need to do that we haven't started doing, but there's a lot that we are already doing. We're just not working together. We're just not talking about it enough. So we sort of tend to fall back on criticizing and pointing fingers and all of that, when in fact something
But
is
Khulekani, isn't that the easy piece of this equation? The communication, if we are seeing such traction on the ground, surely the communication of that is the easy part.
True. I agree with that, but as South Africans, we also have to learn to I suppose, give credit when credit is due. It's easy to criticize any party. It's easy for business to simply criticize, even when something is happening, say, no, but that's not good enough. And similarly, it's easy for government to criticize. But when we adopt the mentality of we're working together here, then we can appreciate what the other party is doing. And I think that's the part that we're learning, and I think we're doing well.
So let's talk about tangible examples. One of my favorite is the National Education Collaboration Trust.
Yes.
That is a partnership between business, government, labour, civil society that has got traction on the ground. Talk to me about it.
Yeah. Well, okay, the analysis, I mean, look, there are 30,000 schools in South Africa. And changing a national education system is tough everywhere. Yeah. What this partnership is focused on is the sort of district level. This is a level that would, combine a couple of thousand schools. I think there are 81 districts, so you can do the division. And we're looking at trying to make those district officers much better at supporting good learning in school. And there are 3 provinces where detailed work has been done. The needs of individual schools in these 8 districts have been plotted. Now the question, and that is the question, is can we fix it? Can we make it a whole lot better? And this will take time. I mean, educational reform is actually generational, because we sit with a group of teachers now. We would hope new teachers would be better teachers, more modern, understanding digital and all these wonderful things. But it's not going to change in a matter of years. It's going to actually change in a decade or so.
Edward, let's pick up on that point that Bobby's just made, and that this is a long-term plan. Perhaps it's not as easy to demonstrate those short-term wins that the investor community is looking for.
Yeah, I think that's fair, and clearly in the area of education, that is a very long-term process to turn things round. But there are other areas where it would be possible to have easier, quicker wins that would really show that things are happening. And in education, for example, it's clearly good that there's a lot of talking going on, but I think at some stage the government has to take action. It may have to get tough. Education standards are fairly poor overall in South Africa if we compare it with other countries on international studies, and if you have situations where teachers have very high levels of absenteeism and no sort of disciplinary action is taken, then clearly that's not going to be good for long-term education standards. So yeah, it's good to talk and it takes time, but I think we do need to see action on the ground to give us confidence that this is a policy, the process that's really moving forward. I think maybe an area where it would be possible perhaps to have quicker results would be in the labour market. It's another area where if you look at the shocking level of unemployment in South Africa, 25%, just over 40% of working age South Africans are in a job. So if progress could be made in that area, freeing up the labour market, which again is one of the most rigid of all emerging markets, then there would be huge potential gains. But there are vested interests involved, and the government may have to be tougher. It may have to take on those vested interests and actually force through some change rather than just going along with the lowest common denominator.
In a way, this goes back to the point I was trying to make earlier, to which Bobby responded, that the business people do not understand politics. There are very many things we can do quickly which require really political courage. Yeah. And he's pointed to those, and to me the Labour one, we're even going in the opposite direction, not only in the immigration sphere, but also in the minimum wage. And again, you just think, okay, so what are we actually trying to achieve here? To say that you're not going to monitor what business is doing, or you want to monitor what business is doing, I'm not sure works, because ultimately it's very easy to measure what's happening here. You look at growth, you look at unemployment, you look at poverty. The things that the NDP wants to achieve, they're very visible, they're very out there, but they do need some brave actions without which we will not break through.
Brave action, Mr. Godsell?
No, indeed, and look, as I would sit here, I would say, again, if we were to have this debate in February 2016, I would hope the immigration rules had been fixed. I would hope that we'd made some real progress on more effective dispute resolution in labour relations. There is actually a national process underway under the leadership of Deputy President Ramaphosa, with a commitment to some kind of more effective intervention to prevent a strike such as we had in the platinum sector for carrying on for 5 months. So I think these would be milestones in which the business are right to say to government, you've got to act, and you need to act bravely. I think the issues for business where action is needed as well.
Trade and Industry Minister Rob Davies was also in Davos promoting doing business in South Africa, and we asked him what response he'd had from business about the National Development Plan.
Very often when I discuss with business people, particularly foreign business people, one of the advantages of coming here is we're talking outside of the South African branch and talking to the leadership of the companies concerned, is they're talking very, very practical issues of implementation. They want to see improved infrastructure, and in often cases they do. They want to know what the incentive programs are, and then very often they've got quite good stories about their interaction with our department. So I think that's the kind of conversation. So it's moved beyond just discussion of policy documents. It's actually now moving into very, very practical issues. And that's the kind of conversation that I've been having with business people.
Good that we're moving into practical issues. Talk to me about these presidential workshops that are currently underway with regard to the National Development Plan.
So you'll recall that President Zuma, I think, was at the first State of the Nation's address after the May 2014 elections, where he said, look, we've recognized the need to work together, and I will be establishing these business working groups to get business and government to talk about the problems and fix those. And so they've been established, and they've had several meetings, and they've agreed and set up streams that are looking at very specific areas of concern for business, and there are joint teams that are looking at what needs to be done there, whether it is dealing with easing the regulatory burden on businesses, or dealing with education and training, infrastructure, and so on. So we're encouraged by that. We're encouraged that we now are moving away from just talking to real action, where we are looking at specific things and working through those challenges.
Edward, let's come back to you. We've been talking about brave action needed in studio here, and I'm staying with this labour issue. What would be the number one thing you would like to see hitting your desk on labour relations in South Africa in terms of brave policy action?
Well, we don't see it as our role to give advice. We more just assess what we see. But I think if we think about potential for the country, going back to this extremely high level of unemployment, one way to think about growth is that it's the product of the number of people in employment and then how much each worker produces, or their productivity. So if some of those unemployed and people not even looking for a job because they're too discouraged could get jobs, it could have a huge benefit to growth and the economy, as well as a huge improvement in social standards. And I think one of the reasons why unemployment is so high in South Africa is because the labour market is extremely inflexible. And studies by the OECD and the World Economic Forum show that it has one of the least flexible wage bargaining systems, have the highest levels of employment protection. So if you can make a difference there, then I think you could lead to lower unemployment. After all, if firms can't lay off a worker if they need to in tough times, they're going to be more reluctant to hire them in the first place. And if workers are on strike all the time or demanding wages above what the firm can afford to pay, then they're going to they're not going to employ people, but they're going to invest in machines or build their factories elsewhere. So I think the labour market is an area where there is huge potential, but clearly it's a very complex and politically sensitive one, and the government they need to carry people with them, but there is potential there if the government can take bold action in terms of making the whole system a bit more flexible.
Let's hear from some of our audience members. We've got Alexander Forbes' boss, Edward Kieswetter, with us. So what are your thoughts?
Thanks. First of all, I agree with all of the comments made before in terms of, for the first time we have a plan. This is probably the most honest diagnostic we've done of our situation. Support the fact that it has to be a partnership. However, I think hiding behind the partnership conversation also does not specifically and accurately denote roles and responsibilities and accountabilities. And I think what I would expect as South African is a lot more clarity and leadership from government, because that's ultimately where power resides, not necessarily resources, but where power resides in terms of creating the enabling mechanism. I mean, we can't in another 6 months' time debate the point that we're not doing enough about socializing and communicating the plan. Because if you can't fix that, which is so easy to fix, then we have bigger problems. So, I mean, I note the point, but let's go and fix it. Let's develop a campaign, a national campaign that engages every South African, but also that makes it tangible for them in terms of what to do. We actually have a lot more people of goodwill in South Africa, both in business, civil society, and just ordinary South Africans. But they sit there, they don't know what to do. And that's a political clarity, and communication can help that significantly. Secondly, I think I do agree that there's a lot of work happening, but it's not visible and not public enough. We're not reporting about it enough. And therefore, it depresses those who aren't part of those or who aren't aware of it. And therefore, I think, we've demonstrated in South Africa there's nothing as non-negotiable or nothing as that gives us much focus as a non-negotiable deadline, like the World Cup. We completed the Gautrain, we fixed up our roads, we built, stadiums. Now, I've got my view about some of the wisdom of some of the stuff we did, but we demonstrated the execution capability because we had an inflexible deadline. So what I would expect is that there be some leadership, and I would vest that with government, to say, this year, this is the 4 things we can do. And I don't agree with the fact that government can't monitor. In areas where they've had the will, like employment equity, I report every year my progress on that. So we can't hide behind government's capability because they simply ask. They legislate. We have to. So for me, I think I agree with the partnership, but I think we would expect a lot more clarity, direction, and communication from government to help every ordinary South African make the plan their own, but in a tangible and a responsive way.
So I agree, bold and courageous action from government. But, in labour relations, government's a secondary player. The primary player are the employers and the unions. And, at the heart, we need to put global competitiveness back into collective bargaining. And here the challenge is overwhelmingly to business. I'm talking to my own constituency. But I can count on one hand, missing most fingers, the number of productivity proposals employers have put into collective bargaining. They've tended to wait for the union to make demands and then try to do their best. On the other hand, and this is directed at our guest in London, there are global motor car companies making motor cars in East London and Port Elizabeth and Oudtshoorn that meet global productivity standards. We are making all right-hand drive cars of a certain model, and we're meeting the Wolfsburg standard of productivity. We can do it if we want to. But business people must take responsibility for labour relations. We forged the relationship, and we should pay decently and expect productive work. And productive work comes from productive design. It's our responsibility to design work processes that are globally competitive, to train and to enforce high levels of efficiency. And our primary responsibility in business is to grow our businesses, and this is one of the ways that we can do it.
I want to open up any other comments from our audience, Bonang?
Thank you very much, Bronwyn. I think let me just echo what Nku and David have said. I'm emboldened by the fact that not only do we have a plan, but we're actually moving towards executing this plan, and we're actually admitting and accepting that this is the one overarching plan rather than confusing all our constituencies. Number two, we know what business everywhere else in the world is looking for. Regulatory certainty, they want stability, they want a little bit of flexibility. Most of the policies that we have enacted are actually an antithesis of that. Sometimes it takes inordinately long. I think we need to learn from what each of the social partners can do. For instance, in business project management, it's something that is done ordinarily. Big projects are delivered in full, on time, and on budget.
What I would like to make is the following quick points. One, there are things we've got that we are proud of in this country, and that's our constitution. And that's a non-negotiable issue. And we need another thing to be proud of, and that is our ability ourselves, never mind foreigners, ourselves to transform this country into a vibrant society. So the NDP should be the Bible, the same as the Constitution. And it's a non-negotiable situation. The second thing is there's too much talk, even, and not trying to sound clever, of how we should talk together with government. Yeah, talk is nice, but when the talk is finished, everybody goes away and nothing happens. Government has a need for skills, and the private sector has got those skills. So unless we sit down together and plan our programs with a business-like attitude which says there have got to be outcomes. Outcomes mean they're dates. You've got to come back with dates and saying this is what we've achieved, or these are the hurdles, and those challenges become our successes.
Let's pick up on those deadlines and execution. Perhaps that's what we need. Deadlines that, there are consequences if you don't meet them.
True. I mean, it's been said by Nku as well that as a country we need to be able to meet deadlines, and we've demonstrated before that we can. Perhaps what I can say here is that I think there is acceptance of this fact on all sides, and I think the conversations have to be about if we say that we're all committed to this plan, what do we each have to do? What does government have to do in order to enable the private sector to do the things that it has to do, and vice versa? And I think it is in conversations like the ones that we were referring to, the sort of business working groups and other such formations. So it doesn't have to be sort of at the level of the presidential working group, because only a few people can access those kinds of platforms. But we should try at sectoral level find ways of actors in that sector talking to regulators, talking to ministries and so on, to really look at what needs to be done, what's holding our progress and development back, and what we need to do to unblock those kinds of things.
But haven't we already done all that analysis? Isn't it now just about the execution and finding a way to work together to execute on the ground?
To some degree we have, and in certain sectors we have, but it's when we get to the level of implementation, that sort of level of granularity, that we have to start talking about specifics that need to be achieved. So the National Development Plan kind of operates at a high level. It talks about the need to create an enabling environment, but what does that enabling environment mean for the mining sector vis-a-vis the agricultural sector? And it is when you get to that level that you need to have a slightly different conversation, but that is a lot more informed.
The fact of the matter is that things are happening all the time. Government is taking action, making decisions, and so this idea that we now have to start implementing also needs a little bit of thinking, because there's implementation all over the place. So if the implementation is not in support of the objectives, then we have to question whether the objectives are serious for government.
You're talking about better coordination of the implementation.
Absolutely, yeah. So I think it's a fallacy to say we have not been implementing. We have been implementing something. Yeah. The issue about education, we have been changing education for 20 years in this country. It is not new. Now, I agree that you can't fetishize a plan so that it's now something where we all go and bow down and pray to it. There has to be flexibility to change if in fact it's not delivering the outcomes that we were hoping for. Because as I said before, you're working at the underpinnings of the thing, hoping for an output. The output doesn't match it, you go back and change. So if you're not communicating, if someone doesn't come out of a presidential working group between governments such as they do with cabinet to say, this is what has been discussed, this is what we're going to do, so that people know how to hold us accountable for the outputs, then it really hobbles the plan before you've actually gotten the traction from the rest of society.
Before we go to closing comments and get a little bit more clarity on communication around the NDP, South Africa's Minister of Economic Development, Abraham Patel, says South Africa's plan must respond to the global economic climate. This is a theme that we touched on a little earlier.
Achieving our goals is more difficult today than it would have been a few years back. But on the other hand, it makes the case more solidly for a development plan that is attuned to South African realities. We can't simply follow global growth. If you look for a plan that we had 10 years ago, 15 years ago, it was to ride the wave of global economic performance. When the rest of the world was doing well, we benefited because we sold minerals to them. Today, when you have commodity prices and demand for iron ore, manganese and so on slowing down elsewhere in the world, we've got to recognize why it's important to diversify our economy, to add more local value, to create jobs and provide investment opportunities by beneficiating our own mineral resources. Instead of selling raw agricultural products, is to invest in an agro-processing sector. So that's where the opportunities lies, but there's also new economies. There is the green economy. South Africa is investing very heavily in renewable energy. And there's the blue economy, using our vast ocean as an opportunity to expand the economy, employment opportunities, and innovation.
Edward, just to close from your side, I think the point has been made repeatedly during today's discussion that implementation is happening on the ground. It's perhaps rather about the communication of that implementation that needs to take place. Your response?
Good communication is always very important, and I think if the government could better communicate the achievements that are being made, then that would increase confidence that the plan actually is being implemented and is delivering results. I think it's very positive that the plan has this broad ownership. It's very carefully crafted and widely debated, and it has general endorsement around the country, and lots of discussions are taking place. But in terms of actual results on the ground, I think it's harder for us to actually see that things really are happening. And whether it's a case of implementation or whether it's a case of just better communication, maybe it's a bit of both. But if we did see progress in that area, then I think that would be very positive.
Nku, perhaps you can weigh in as chairman of the JSE on closing comments.
Well, we are in the business of trying to make certain that our investors, whether be listed on the JSE or investors on the JSE, are always plugged into these conversations. And so we've been very, very active in getting the business community talking to government across multiple platforms. We very recently hosted an investor conference in New York, which I thought was very, very well attended, went very, very well. So some of the comments that came from the ministers from Davos are certainly the things that we heard coming out of the New York Investor Conference. And in there, actually, they're very, very complimentary about the South African private sector. So it is very resourceful. So we're very, very au fait with some of the examples that Bobby has quoted. The issue was just, what is the engine for growth? So I think the issue is, having moved beyond, is NDP good or bad, and just get on with it.
Khulekani, before I get from Mr. Bobby Godsell.
Two things from me. Firstly, I think to thank CNBCA for this platform, because it's important to have the conversation, but also to talk about what's working and what's not working, for the very reasons that have been discussed here. So I think this is an important platform. And secondly, to say that it's important to I mean, in South Africa we've always said that we need to get better at implementation of our plans and our programs. There's something in the example of the National Education Collaboration Trust. Now, Edward was saying that it's easy to keep talking and that sort of thing. I'd beg to disagree with him a bit, because the approach that was taken in that initiative was to say that education is so huge that you want to try something, see how it works before you apply it in the whole system. The second thing was that pilot had to be big enough to demonstrate that it can work in the system as a whole, because we've had examples where the private sector or anybody, for instance, would work with two schools and say, I have a winning model. When you try to upscale that, it falls apart. So what the design of this initiative did was to say it has to be a pilot, but it has to be big enough to demonstrate that it can be taken to scale and succeed. So yes, implementation is happening. We need to talk about that, but we also need to learn lessons as we implement, so that we can feed those lessons back into the system and improve and do better. So I'm encouraged that we are on the right track.
I'm going to get you to wear both your hats to close out our debate. That, of course, as Chairman of Business Leadership South Africa, and also as a Commissioner of the National Development Plan, Mr. Bobby Godsell.
Look, I'd really like to talk as a business person. The NDP challenge for every single business in South Africa is to make sure that in 2030 it's 3 times the size that it was in 2012. It's as simple as that. If we want to grow the economy 3 times, the private sector must be at least 3 times its present size. This is perfectly possible. In the first 15 years of our democracy, 80% of the members of Business Leadership South Africa more than doubled the size of their businesses. So that requires strong entrepreneurship, fantastic marketing, good labor relations. It also requires a courageous government that's prepared to slaughter the holy cows and move on. and it also requires cooperative labour. I think these things are perfectly possible. And actually having an electricity crisis makes the need that much more obvious.
And that sense of urgency is right there. Thank you so much to my guest today, Khulekani Mathe, Acting Secretary of National Planning, Mr. Bobby Godsell, an NDP Commissioner and also Chairman of Business Leadership South Africa, Nku Nyembezi-Heita, Chairperson of the JSE, and in our London studio, Edward Parker, Managing Director, Head of Europe, Middle East and Africa at Fitch Ratings. And thank you so much to our live audience. That's it from CNBC Africa, and that's our first in many of our discussions around the National Development Plan, a plan in motion.